Chapter 7 Calamity. They walked slowly, keeping close together, looking carefully before each step in case the sudden deep pits or nightmarish beasts that people had always whispered about were really there. Dune was using the generator now, cranking it briskly. Lena, walking right beside him, held a candle. Their circle of light was bigger than with the candles alone, but all they saw in it was sandy-colored ground scattered with rocks and pebbles, with an occasional crack or ridge that they had to step over. "There's litter out here," Lena said after a while. She pointed with her foot at an empty can. A few steps farther on, there was another empty can, and not far beyond that, a broken jar. "How did this stuff get here?" "Rats, I guess," said Dune. "They must have dragged it out from the trash heaps." Since they were now on the same level as the city, instead of looking down into it from above, they didn't see the light as a spot anymore, but as a dim background glow that made a few edges and corners of buildings visible. And they could see this glow only when they paused now and then and Dune stopped cranking his generator, because the brightness of the generator's light bulb blinded them to the fainter light beyond. It was lucky, Lena thought, that there was light in the city at all. If the darkness had been complete, they wouldn't have even known where the city was. They could have wandered around in the unknown regions for a long time before heading in the right direction, and they wouldn't have known it was the right direction until they'd practically bumped into a building. Step by step they moved on, lighting their way just a few feet ahead, and suddenly the lit ground in front of their feet disappeared into darkness. Baffled at first, they came to a halt. Then Dune crept forward, inches at a time. Lena heard him gasp and say, "Oh no!" "What?" "The ground ends," Dune said. "It drops away here. We're standing on the edge of, I don't know, a hole or a chasm." Lena stepped forward and stood beside him and looked down. The toes of their shoes were right up against a black emptiness. She couldn't tell how deep or wide it was. Their light penetrated only a few feet down and forward, and beyond that all was dark. "We'll have to go around it," Dune said. "We can't go down in there." "Never," said Lena with a shudder. "Let's try going to the left," said Dune. They backed away from the edge, turned, and with great caution headed along the rim of the hole. Minutes passed, and more minutes, and still they were walking beside the black emptiness on and on. "It isn't a hole, then," said Dune finally. "It's a sort of ditch." He pondered for a moment. "It might go all the way around the city." "A ring," Lena said. "To keep people from leaving." This brought them to a stop. Lena recalled the whispered rumors she had heard all her life about people who had gone out into the unknown regions and never returned. They could be down there, what was left of them. "We have to go back," she said. "We can't get across it." "I wish we could tell how wide it is," said Dune. "If it's deep, but not very wide, then maybe we could." "How?" said Lena. "Jump?" She meant this as a joke, but Dune didn't laugh. He said, "Didn't you bring some scraps of paper with you?" "Yes." "Can I have a couple of them?" Dune asked. "I have an idea." Lena pulled 2 of her scraps of paper from her pack and handed them to him. Dune bent over and looked around until he found a small stone on the ground. He wrapped the stone in the paper and held the paper to Lena's candle until it caught fire, and then quickly he threw the flaming packet out over the chasm. It flew up and then dropped, farther and farther, until it struck with a small tap far below their feet and went out. "One more try," said Dune. "I'll throw harder." He lit the little packet and heaved it with all his strength. This time it flew out in a long arc and landed at the same level as the ground they were standing on. It looked to Lena to be maybe 10 feet away. "So, it's a deep crevice," Dune said, "but not all that wide." "Too wide to get across," said Lena. "We have to turn around." So they retraced their steps. The chasm now yawned on their other side. Lena forced fearsome pictures from her mind, rats crawling up over the edge, other creatures even worse than rats. "Let's hurry," she said. They came to the place where they'd begun, recognizing it by the bits of litter that lay on the ground there. "This is where we go back to the path," said Dune. "But I hate to give up, now that we've come all this way." "We have to," Lena said. "Otherwise we'll just walk around and never get to the city." "We don't know that for sure. Let's go a little farther, just in case." And after only a few steps, they saw the way. 2 thick planks stretched across the chasm. "Someone made a bridge," Dune said. It was not a bridge that inspired confidence. Narrow, slightly sagging, with no rails to hold onto, it reached out into the darkness, and below waited the invisible depths. But beyond was the city. "Shall we try?" asked Dune. Lena just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Dune put his generator back in his pack and lit a candle from the flame of Lena's. Then he started across. With each step he paused, looking ahead and not down. The planks creaked beneath his feet. Lena held her breath, as if even breathing too hard might knock Dune off his balance. His light drew farther away, but quite soon he turned to face her from the other side. "You can do it!" he cried. "It's not hard!" She stepped out. She looked only at her feet, one step, and then the next. The boards of the bridge shuddered a little beneath her. It was good, she thought, that she couldn't see how deep the space below her was. She was almost there. Dune stood just ahead. She would have been fine if she had not let her eyes stray at the last moment and caught a glimpse of white. In spite of herself, she turned to see a tumble of pale sticks on the slope of the pit, just below her. Bones. She staggered and fell to her knees. Her candle dropped into the pit and went out. She clung there, gripping the boards with her hands. "Don't move!" cried Dune. "I'm coming!" She waited, all her muscles clenched, and in a moment Dune was in front of her. She gripped his hand, stood up, and followed him on shaky legs to the bridge's end. "All right?" he asked. She nodded, but her mind was spinning. She knew people died. She knew that the dead of Ember were carried out past the trash heaps, that the song of goodbye was sung for them, and that their bodies were left for the rats and worms to deal with. Everyone in Ember knew this. But to think about those who had fallen to their deaths alone in the darkness, in terror, that was different. "Let's go," she said. "I want to get away from here." So they hurried on, lighting the way with just Dune's candle, now that the haze of light from the city was so close. "Do you smell something?" Lena asked. Dune sniffed. "I do. It smells like smoke." "Could a building be on fire?" Lena wondered. "I don't know," said Dune. "I hope not." They walked on. The orange light stayed more or less steady, though the smell of smoke grew stronger. They realized they had reached the city when a wall suddenly appeared not 5 feet in front of them. The candlelight, instead of making a circle beneath their feet, seemed to fold upward at the farthest edge. A few steps closer, and they could put their hands out and feel the chilly stone of the building. Dune raised his candle higher to see if there were any clues about what building they had come to, but of course there weren't. None of the buildings in Ember had windows or doors on the side that faced the unknown regions. Keeping one hand on the wall, they made their way along until they came to a corner, and there Lena looked for a street sign. She found it easily. A pole with its small printed rectangle on top. Deeple Street.
Deeple Street,
she said, and in her mind the whole city and their position in it fell into place.
We're on the north side, in Farwater Square. Look, here's a light pole.
Dune's candle lit up the base of the pole, but the top, where before a great lamp would have been shining, was lost in darkness. On the corner of Deeple and Blot Streets, an old white rocking chair stood, for some reason. Maybe someone had put it out as trash, although to Lena it looked perfectly sturdy.
All right, good, said Dune. So first let's find where that light is coming from.
Lena took out a candle and lit it from Dune's. She wanted to see everything as well as possible. They started down Blot Street, Dune ahead and Lena close behind. It was strange and thrilling to be in her old city. Even though their candles lit only a very small area around them, her memory easily filled in the rest. Here was one of Ember's many old clothes shops, the one run by Sarman Grohl. Here was the market where she'd bought so many turnips and beets and jars of baby food. Here was the house where she'd once taken a message to an old man who collected string. It was all familiar, but so strange, too, because of the silence and emptiness. No people bustled past the stone buildings anymore. The great street lamps fixed to the building's eaves no longer sent out yellow pools of light. Lena's candlelight glimmered on dark, cracked shop windows, fell into the gulf of open doors, and lit bottom steps of stairways, where sometimes there was a sock or a scarf, dropped by someone in a hurry to leave. Lena peered at everything she passed, identifying, remembering. By the time they came to Clothing Square, she'd fallen quite a distance behind Dune. She saw that he, too, must be absorbed in remembering, because he didn't seem to notice she was no longer near him. She hurried to catch up. They mustn't get separated. But she couldn't help pausing once again when she came to the messenger station. This was where she'd come on the first day of her first job, which had been assigned to her on her last day of school. She'd been given her red jacket and told the rules, and then she'd been off, running through the streets of the city, carrying messages everywhere. She'd loved being a messenger. She gazed at the empty spot, where beside a door was a bench with a couple of red jackets flung across it. A wave of sadness washed over her, and she looked away and hurried on up the street toward the tiny glow of Dune's candle far ahead. Then suddenly she heard a shout. Dune's voice. What was he saying? She froze, trying to hear. Another shout. No! No! And with it, voices that were not Dune's. So people were here after all. But what Lena was hearing didn't sound like friendly greetings. She started to run, but she went too fast. Before she'd gone 10 steps, the air rushing past blew her candle out. There was nothing to do but stop. She stood where she was, on Greystone Street, almost, she thought, to Passwall. Peered at the glimmerings in the distance that now looked like 2 candles, not just one, and listened. The gruff voices growled and snarled and overlapped each other, and she couldn't make out the words. But Dune's voice rose high and clear. "Let go of me!" he cried. Terror drained away Lena's strength, but she knew when she saw the lights fade and the voices grow more distant that she had to move. She had to keep track of Dune. She couldn't lose him. She would have to run, and without her candle, the only light came from way up ahead of her. From the people who'd caught Dune and the dim glow behind them. Quickly, she bent down, took her shoes off, and thrust them into her backpack. She could go more quietly in her socks. Then, keeping her eyes on the tiny lights ahead and one hand stretched out, fingers brushing the wall, she ran. Dune's voice came again. "I did come alone! I'm by myself!" Lena understood. "Do not let them see you." That was Dune's message. Someone had caught him, and she mustn't let it happen to her. She traced the map of Ember in her mind as she went. "I'm behind the gathering hall now.
I'm passing Rover Street, on my right." She hardly let herself breathe, for fear she might be heard. She ran as fast as she could without being able to see where she was stepping, and very soon she drew close to the voices and the moving lights. Too close. She couldn't just run up behind them and follow along. She would have to get ahead of them somehow, find a hiding place she could watch from, and see who they were and what they were doing with Dune. So she turned and went along the back of the gathering hall. If she went fast, she could hide behind the trash bin at the far corner by the prison room and see if they came out into Harkin Square or went another way. There was a chance that she'd get confused. Complete darkness can erase your mental map, as she well knew. But if she was sure she was out of sight, she could light her candle again. So she crept forward, rounded the corner of the gathering hall, and placed herself behind the trash bin. The light here was brighter than ever, and the smoke smell was stronger. Now that she had stopped running, Lena found that she was shaking all over. Everything had happened so suddenly. Their plan, which had been going so well, had been changed in an instant. Now what? Now what? As if in answer to her question, Dune's voice pierced the darkness again. He was farther away now. His words weren't as clear, but what she thought she heard was, "Get away! Go home! Get—" There was a pause, and then, "Help!" Was this a message meant for her? Was he telling her to go home and get help? She wasn't sure. Cautiously, moving a fraction of an inch at a time, she looked out from behind the trash bin. Right away she saw them. 2 men with Dune between them, on the far side of Harkin Square, each with a grip on one of Dune's arms. And in the center of the square, so bright it made her squint, was the source of the orange light they'd seen from above. It was indeed a fire. Lena had gotten past the terror of open flame that she'd had when she first arrived in Sparks. She'd become used to fire, at least the kind of fire that's helpful, the kind that lets you cook and keep warm. But this was a big, disorderly fire, right on the pavement, a spreading heap of charred rubble, shooting up flames in some spots and smoldering in others. It cast a wavering orange glare out across Harkin Square, on the kiosks where old posters still hung, on the wide steps of the gathering hall, and on 3 figures who scurried around the fire's edges. 1 big one, and 2 smaller ones. As Lena watched, the tallest of the fire tenders bent over, picked something up in one hand, and threw it toward the fire. Lena saw its black silhouette as it fell, flapping and fluttering, toward the flames. Sheets of paper, she thought. In fact, she was sure it was a book.